Hello, I'm Morris Ruddick. We've been talking about Jewish business secrets. We've taken a look at the foundations, the model, and gifts that are vital to understanding the dynamics of what have given Jews the renown of being a people of business. Now, before we start digging into the dynamics of entrepreneurship, I want to cover some background about Jewish culture. This background will provide keen insights into the uniqueness of entrepreneurship from a Jewish perspective. In a world where business is too often equated with large corporate enterprises, it is important to remember that these organizations usually began with a much more humble beginning. Likewise, the world tends to place the qualification for business success on the amount of money produced. Investors want to know how fast startups can reach certain thresholds. The foundations of Jewish culture provide a much greater emphasis on a long-term, bottom-up way of looking at business. It is more concerned with the role of small businesses in building the community, of being the backbone of a trust society. This does not negate the benefits to be derived from large enterprises, but simply points to the responsibility shared by each in the community, which is the result of centuries of a Torah-defined culture. Embracing the dynamics comprising Jewish business secrets requires a different way of thinking. Understanding the culture offers keen insights into the way Jewish people think. The thinking process derived from Jewish cultural foundations is far more creative and Eastern. One of the key strategies employed by Jews and reinforced by the teachings of Jesus was that of being a culture within a culture. Jesus described this truth as God's people being a light on a hill which cannot be hidden. This is a context resulting in a different way of thinking. The edge we observe in Jewish business typically draws from this distinctiveness. Yet it bears a compatibility between our cultural and entrepreneurial foundations. One of the most dramatic stories in Jewish writings illustrating this dynamic is the story of Joseph the Patriarch. Joseph was the great-grandson of Abraham. Abraham exhibited the model in which the community was supported, built, and maintained by the mix of the spiritual and the entrepreneurial. The Jewish community orientation provides the means of self-sufficiency. Abraham operated a God-centered, entrepreneurial community. It is a model based on the type of leadership that serves. So the story of Joseph is an apt illustration of the strategy of God's people operating as a culture within a culture. The story of Joseph is one of family intrigue. Joseph was the 11th of 12 brothers. Not only was he the favorite of their father, but his spiritual acumen far outweighed that of his older brothers. Joseph walked with God and was extremely prophetic. When Joseph was but 17 years of age, he and his brothers bore much responsibility for running the family business. Nevertheless, contrary to the foundations exhibited by their forebear Abraham, Joseph's brothers were consumed with jealousy. The abbreviated story is that his brothers reacted poorly to his paternal favor and spiritual wisdom, and deceived Joseph and sold him into slavery, and told their father that Joseph had been killed. Yet God, who knows the end from the beginning, had the big picture in mind. He was preparing to use Joseph to avert disaster caused by earlier deceitful behavior of his brothers with another local community. So Joseph's sale into slavery took him to Egypt. In Egypt, Joseph became a servant in the household of a high-level government official by the name of Potiphar. Joseph's stewardship as a slave in this man's house was such that Scripture describes it with the words, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and everyone saw that the Lord was with Joseph and made all that he did to prosper." Joseph was bringing the culture established by Abraham into the way he operated as a slave in Potiphar's house. He was being blessed and was extending that blessing to the way he stewarded his responsibilities. Joseph was soon entrusted with the responsibilities over all of Potiphar's household. The distinction of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being with him was evidenced by the way God blessed and prospered his efforts. Joseph stewarded his responsibilities faithfully. The Egyptians, who did not believe in the God of Israel, came to see the reality of God through the life and results achieved by Joseph. However, there then came a time when Joseph experienced spiritual backlash. A grasp of the dynamics of the spiritual world is vital to any who follow God. It entails the age-old conflict between good and evil. Even within each generation are those who are drawn to God and the good. However, there also are those whose path is lined with compromise and deceit, who in the final analysis hate God. Joseph ran into such conflict, and despite his upright way of doing things for Potiphar, he was unrighteously accused of something he didn't do, and he was put into prison. So, going from bad to worse, Joseph, who had lost his family, along with his freedom in being made a slave, was now imprisoned. Prison in those days were pretty rough. Despite the circumstances, Joseph once again was seen as being trustworthy and capable, and the keeper of the prison soon put him over all the other prisoners. In all these hard circumstances, Joseph maintained his cultural identity, along with his attitude and behavior, unwaveringly honoring the God of his fathers. The result was God blessing him in these difficult circumstances, with Joseph extending these blessings to those he served. God was with him, and this fact was evident to everyone around him. I've previously mentioned the ancient Jewish writings that say a man's gift makes room for him and brings him before great men. This is what happened to Joseph. While still in prison, but being in charge of the other prisoners, two men from Pharaoh's court were imprisoned. One was the king's baker, the other the king's wine taster. One night, each of these men had dreams, together with being incarcerated. Their dreams troubled them deeply. They mentioned the dreams to Joseph. Joseph, through his prophetic gift, interpreted both dreams accurately. Pharaoh's wine taster was soon restored to his position, according to Joseph's interpretation of his dream. Then began a time of Joseph waiting on God's timing. Roughly 2 years later, Pharaoh also had some troubling dreams. The wine taster told him about Joseph, and Joseph was sent for to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. During his 13 years of slavery and prison, Joseph learned to depend on God. The prophetic gift that riled his brothers had been finely honed. So when Joseph was brought from the humble surroundings of his prison dungeon to Pharaoh's palace, he had no illusions other than to begin by telling Pharaoh that only through God was he able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. So it was that Joseph outlined what the dreams meant together with the strategy of the response Pharaoh should take. Pharaoh was amazed. His response was, "Can we find such a man as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Inasmuch as God has shown you these things, there is no one as wise and discerning as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. I am setting you over all the land of Egypt." In the next 7 years, in accordance with his interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph diligently amassed and stored huge amounts of grain. Then, according to the dreams, severe famine hit. Joseph's greatest exploits then took place during the time of great crisis, during the famine. His preparation and role as a prophetic steward honored both Pharaoh and God and illustrates the importance of some significant Jewish secrets. Joseph heard from God, and despite personal hardship, he never wavered. He culturally identified himself as God's ambassador. His identity was not determined by position, status, or wealth. Then, when his circumstances got worse, his response was to dig in and to move in even closer to God. One of the greatest prayers of the psalmist are the words, "Teach me your ways, O Lord, and I will walk in your truth. Unite my heart to fear your name." Joseph walked in God's truth with an undivided heart. Joseph's anticipatory response to the time of crisis required an alliance with one who combined favor toward Joseph, a spiritual openness, and the authority and resources for the strategy to avert disaster. Only God could have orchestrated all this. When the famine hit full force, the money failed. The only thing of value was grain, which Joseph had stored in abundance. Operating according to the mantle of Abraham, to be blessed to be a blessing, Joseph cornered the livestock market, then the real estate market, and in the process, the people stayed fed. During the peak of the famine, as the situation digressed into desperation and lawlessness outside the realm, Joseph brought the people into the safe confines of the city and kept them fed. That included the members of his family who had betrayed him. Once the famine subsided, Joseph returned the land to its owners in return for a 20% subsidy of their annual harvest. Joseph was a major example of how good overcomes evil. Joseph demonstrated how stewardship and an identity and faith in God can influence and release God's authority to harness the spiritual climate and resources of a society that doesn't have a knowledge of God. Joseph then managed the largest wealth transfer the world had ever seen. In the process, he redeemed his wayward, betraying brothers while also bringing God's blessing to his adopted nation. I'm Morris Ruddick. Next time, we'll be talking about how culture influences change for good.